Good morning. Welcome to the garden on this beautiful October morning. A little different from last week, huh? If you were here last Sunday, we're not ending with Love Train today, so you don't have to get ready to form a love train at all. But yet it's an important topic for us to think about, I think, this morning. Darkness, it seems to me, over the years has really kind of gotten a bad rap. In fact, for me, it probably started when I was a child and would be out playing in those wonderful summer evenings, and I'd hear my mom or dad call to me and say, "You got to come in now, it's getting dark. You can't be outside after dark." And I suppose as children, sometimes we were afraid of the dark, maybe thinking there's monsters under our bed or something really creepy and awful outside our bedroom door. And so that's when we'd go running to mom and dad and want to snuggle up against and be safe from all of that. So probably each of us has our own kind of personal history when it comes to darkness. It may be something that we were taught, or it may have just been something that we think we gained or learned as a result of our own experience. Now, we talk about darkness in a whole variety of ways. For example, sometimes we'll say, well, I'm totally in the dark on that, which means we don't have a clue what's going on. We have no knowledge at all about anything. I've been known to say I can't see my hand in front of me when I go from the light into the dark because I have no night vision and I really can't see my hand in front of me. There's sometimes we use dark to describe emotions that we carry, like fear or despair or grief of one kind or another. And the reality is many of us try our best to avoid anything that's dark. We don't like those dark thoughts or dark happenings that occur in our lives, and we try to avoid it. And if those dark emotions somehow invade us, we try our best to put them aside, to force them out of our thinking, and to really force ourselves to think about happier thoughts so that we don't have to go there. We don't have to deal with that kind of darkness. Now, there's another kind of darkness that's been in the news a lot lately with Robin Williams' death, and that was the darkness of depression. I feel very blessed and very fortunate that I've never had that personal experience in my life, but I've certainly known a lot of folks who have. And I know that for them, many times it feels as though they're walking around with this dark, ominous cloud over their head that they can't get rid of. And most of the folks I know have the opportunity to have a very good and trusted therapist who can help them manage the depression that they're dealing with. And if you're in that situation, I hope the same is true for any of you. But do know that while they're not exactly equipped to deal with something quite like depression, do know that we do have a comfort and care team here that always has an open heart and a listening ear, and can help provide some resources and directions and ways to go. But that's not the kind of darkness I really want us to deal with today. Instead, I want to think about the kind of darkness that Barbara Brown Taylor talks about in her most recent book that's entitled Learning to Walk in the Dark. And her point in writing this book, I think, was her understanding that there are things we can learn in the dark that we can't learn in the light, that we have to have darkness in our life. In fact, at one point she says, I need darkness as much as I need light. And she thinks we all do, and I think I have to agree with her on that. Now, let's think about the Bible passage I chose for today and how it might fit in with all of this. I actually chose the very first part, the first creation story in the book of Genesis. The version we have is from the Message, and this is how it reads. God spoke, light, and light appeared. God saw that light was good and separated light from dark. God named the light day and named the dark night. It was evening. It was morning. Day one. Of course, this story is not meant to be taken literally. It is, in fact, a story that is symbolic or metaphorical, if you will, and one of the mythologies that was circulating at the time about how the world came into being. There were other ancient Near East mythologies that told stories that were quite similar to this. And all those stories were really just attempts by human beings to figure out how this world as we know it had come into being. Where did the light and darkness come from? And this was one of the stories that was told. And I think there are a couple things we can take from this story. One is that light and darkness are both part of life. That's just the way life is. It's the way the world is. Now, we can do that on a physical level, a literal level, but we can go a little deeper than that and think about it on a symbolic level. Over the years, light has come to represent that which is good, and dark has represented that which we consider to be not quite as good. And so if we think about it in that vein, I think what it's saying to us is that all our lives will be filled with the good and the things that aren't so good. That's just what life is. Things happen in the course of living life. There are the ups and downs. There are the ebbs and flows that come and go. And that's the reality of what life is all about. But there's a very real sense in which we have a physical need for both light and dark. And that's because of what's called our circadian rhythm. Now, I had really forgotten all about that until I read her book, and she talks about that. The circadian rhythm has to do with our physical, mental, and behavioral changes that operate on basically a 24-hour cycle and respond most to light and dark. If any of us have ever spent any time anywhere where there's huge amounts of darkness or huge amounts of light, we probably understand what this is all about. Because there's a rhythm to our lives that gets disrupted when we have too much of one and not enough of the other. I remember one time being in the very northern part of Scotland, like 20 years ago or so, and it was right around the summer solstice, which is the longest day, the longest hours of sunlight in that particular time of on the calendar. And there was like 22 or 22 and a half hours of daylight. So it got dark about 2 or 2:30 in the morning, and by 4 or 4:30 it was light again, and darkness wasn't even really dark. And what we discovered is that it was really hard to get the sleep and the rest that we needed because it so disrupted our normal rhythm and normal understanding. Well, that certainly is a way in which we experience light and darkness. But there are other ways too. We have dark times in our lives. Things happen in the course of living. Sometimes relationships fall apart, or a business fails, or a child gets in trouble, or a loved one dies, or illness strikes. Things happen to us in life, and we feel as though we're plunged into darkness, a terribly dark time, and that there's no way out of it. We feel totally alone, totally distracted, totally discarded, not attached at all to anyone or anything. While that may be an existential crisis, it very often leads to a spiritual crisis too. In fact, there's a term that's used to describe that, and it's referred to as a dark night of the soul, when we're struggling spiritually, when we really are in a dark place spiritually. That's something we probably all experience at one time or another in our lives, and for varying lengths of time. It just simply happens. And even some of the people that we regard as some of the holiest people have acknowledged that they too have gone through the dark nights of the soul. In fact, I read an article about Mother Teresa that was written, 7 or 8 years ago now, I think. And, Mother Teresa we regard so highly as a saintly kind of person who spent her life caring for those who were suffering and who needed care and love, and she offered it. And yet she admitted that there were times she felt God had deserted her, that she was totally abandoned, that she was totally on her own. She was experiencing a dark night of the soul. Now, Barbara Brown Taylor says that if we get in that place, in that dark night of the soul place, in a spiritual darkness, that the church is of absolutely no help. They really don't want to deal with us if we're in that place. We're sometimes seen as unfaithful, as someone who simply shouldn't be that way. We're not a very good person if we have hours of spiritual darkness. And yet, that's a reality. It's a fact of life. Sometimes if we are connected to people who are religious, very often you'll hear what I refer to as pious platitudes. These phrases that come rolling off that are really pretty empty. They don't really offer any solace. They don't offer any advice. There's no way to identify with the hurt and the struggle that someone's going through. There's no sense of care or compassion or sensitivity that seems to be expressed when that happens. Now, when Barbara Brown Taylor talks about the dark night of the soul and the fact that she doesn't find the church to be helpful, she says that out of personal experience. because part of what she writes, and part of the reason I like her is because she is so brutally honest, is about her own spiritual darkness. She wrote these words: "If I have any expertise, it is in the realm of spiritual darkness, fear of the unknown, familiarity with divine absence, mistrust of conventional wisdom, suspicion of religious comforters, keen awareness of the limits of all language about God, and at the same time shame over my inability to speak of God without 1,000 qualifiers, doubt about the health of my soul, and barely suppressed contempt for those who have not such qualms. These are the areas of my proficiency." Well, if we can identify with any of that, and I have to tell you, there are times that I certainly can identify with her, what do we do about it? How do we deal with it? For one thing, we have to acknowledge it, to acknowledge that that's simply where we are, and that's the place where we're living at this particular time. And I think what is helpful, at least for me, and I think for her too, is to acknowledge what we're experiencing, to try to describe what it is for us. I think that's really what she was doing with this book. She was writing about her own spiritual darkness and trying to come to terms with it for her. And writing is something that some of us really like to use. So maybe if we're in that place, or at some point if we find ourselves in that place, we might think about writing, whether that's sitting at our computer or pulling out an unused journal and beginning to write about, to try to describe what we're feeling, what we're experiencing, what are the doubts, what are the questions, and to just kind of pour it all out there and lay it out. And if we're fortunate, maybe we'll have a trusted friend who will listen to us and allow us to share without judging us, without condemning us for any lack of faith, but in fact will just be there with us and will listen to us and experience whatever we're experiencing to the best extent possible. And maybe if we have those kinds of things, we can get to the point of living with our questions and our doubts, knowing that there's always ambiguity, there's always uncertainty, and that's just where we are, and that's an okay place to be. There are no pat answers for what we're going through. And you know, even when we're in that time of darkness, I somehow still believe that it's not dark for God. God is always with us. God is by our side no matter what. Now, a few weeks ago, we talked about serendipitous kind of things. And you know, sometimes I think we see God. We, of course, can't see God. We sometimes don't feel as though we know God. But yet, if we look with a certain kind of eyes, I think we'll see God. And it sometimes comes in the form of the hug of a friend, or a phone call, or a note, or a comment just when we need it. That's sometimes the way that we experience God's presence. It may be a matter of being with the right people at the right time and hearing what they have to say for us. But I really believe that no matter where we are, we will experience those times of spiritual darkness. And maybe we can find some comfort in knowing that God never fails us, is always there with us, and may be there pushing and nudging us to take that first step, that then we can take a next step, and then we can begin to get a glimpse of the light.